Okay, it's a pleasure to be able to stand here and just share with you some thoughts and findings on some of the work I've been doing with my good friend, co-author Zhang Dayong from the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics. So what I'm going to talk about today is just something about how maybe the world has changed and that there's been an increase in the interplay of commodity prices. I'm going to take as an example, just to focus the discussion to an interesting point, the connection between food and fuel, but really to just try to elevate the potential conclusion that the commodity prices we face, or more to the point, the input prices that we face in running businesses have become quite intricately and delicately and potentially dangerously connected. So that's what I'll play through. So commodities are the underlying physical assets that do shape economic activity. We need to use these in order to generate things that we can use to make money, even just in terms of eating, so that we have energy to provide services. So it's not just physical products. There has been an awful lot of concern that commodity prices have become increasingly more connected. My personal background is in the economics of energy, and it's a huge topic of debate in oil markets in particular. Have we moved into a period where oil prices are being driven by financialization? And this remains an open question. And so this work was kind of feeding into our ongoing work to try to address this type of concern. Here I'm just going to take a look at 7 core commodity classes. I'm going to take global prices. These are from standard data sources that are all referenced in the paper. These cover the beverages, fertilizers, food, metals, precious metals, raw materials, and oil, or more to the point, maybe energy, core commodity classes. It's me. You see the likeness? My hair is on the way. What we decided to do was to try to view these commodities as an interconnected network. There are equations behind it. You don't need to look at this. I'm just constantly reminded that if I want to pretend to be an economist, I should show an equation at some point. But our objective was to try to just take these commodity classes and pose a question. If we treat them as a network, and in particular as a network that can evolve through time, can we learn anything about how these commodities are connected to each other, and more importantly, how that connection has evolved through time? Are we seeing essentially increased interplay between them, which would suggest that we're moving away from pure fundamentals, that it's not just the things which determine the demand and supply of the products which result in the final price of the product. So any changes in the way that the network is connected becomes some kind of a measure of increased interplay between these markets, and which in turn implies some changing degree of shared risk. So we wanted to test whether or not they have become connected in any material sense. There's always going to be some kind of connection between the markets. Energy and fertilizers are naturally connected to each other through the petrochemicals connection. In recent years, and particularly since 2008, economists have done a great deal to try to understand how to measure and quantify connected risk, or something that we typically refer to as systemic risk. How much has the risk or the evolution of activity within a market become connected within a system rather than disconnected as something that's not system-like? And I will take advantage of some of those tools. And so they allow us to understand essentially where risk is, where it's generated from and where it's going to, and how this has evolved through time. And here's a basic snapshot. Here on this graph, we have a rather complicated diagram, but actually at the same time it's relatively simple. I have my 7 commodity classes, and these are across the top and the bottom. So going from left to right, we have beverages, fertilizers, food is where we're going to concentrate our discussion. We have metals, precious metals, raw materials, and oil. And then at the bottom, we have the same commodities. And what this graph is trying to visualize is where the changes in prices in one market are coming from, where they're going to. I mean, it's kind of doing both at the same time. And so we can, for example, see here that close to 100% of the final change in food prices derives from activity stemming from the food market itself. And that whilst there's a small amount of feed-in from other commodities into food, at least in October of 2005, the prices for food and for all of the other commodities were largely independent of each other, supporting the view that these are driven by fundamentals. But then we had some changes. 2008, well, it's interesting. 2008 has the 8 in it, and 8 seems to have been an unlucky number. Maybe that's changed the way that Chinese investors perceive the value of 8. That's another story. But we had a financial crisis. It turns out that the consequence of this crisis to commodity markets was extremely dramatic, and this is not something which has been played out very carefully in our academic understandings. We've been trying deeply to unpack the risk that's been occurring in the the equity markets. This has been our primary interest. And yet at the same time, we see that before the financial crisis, the level of total network connectivity in commodity prices was down at 11% on average. And then afterwards, it went up to more than 43%. And it stayed there. It's not reversing. In addition to this, we can take another look at the type of graph that we just took a look at, the network, and we can see that what's happened is that things have become intricately more connected. Now, truthfully, on this graph, we do not just see that food prices are increasingly susceptible to oil prices. We see that all prices have become much more closely connected. And that's the underlying conclusion, that if we're managing businesses and we use large amounts of commodities to run these businesses, then we can no longer ignore the price changes that are occurring in other commodity classes. But we do see, and it's maybe not so visible from the graph, but the role of oil into food has increased dramatically. And food, nowadays, only contributes about 50% of its own price. 50% of the price of food, or more perhaps, is coming from other places. So this is potentially a very concerning feature. On this particular table, very briefly, I just wish to add further evidence that actually the role of energy prices here is very important. And really what I'm just trying to add with this, or remind us, let us say, is that oil is of particular interest amongst these commodity classes because actually oil is a volatile product. The prices of oil fluctuate a lot, and there's a lot of geopolitical dimensions behind oil. We have things like OPEC, which is now beginning to fall apart, with Qatar, potentially fall apart, I should say, with Qatar removing itself from the group. We have Canada promising to shut down its oil production, and we have many things in between taking place. So oil does have perhaps a special interest amongst these commodity classes. Anyway, the key implications of this analysis are simply to highlight that the dynamics of commodity price risk have quite tremendously evolved, and they do not show signs of being reversible yet. This does potentially pose new challenges that I think it's useful to be aware of, that in predicting the importance or controlling or hedging against the potential future price risk, we cannot just look at one of the commodities. We have to be mindful of others. Okay. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.